right at 11:30. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining CertaPay's first coffee break. We're very excited you're here. This is managing the remote workforce, and we're going to continue the conversation after this coffee break next week with coffee break number 2 on more remote workforce issues. So for the purpose of this one, we're really going to be talking about the policies and procedures that will be important with managing your remote workforce. So as I said, if you want to ask a question, the Zoom group chat box is available in that top bar under the word more. You can open that up, and we've got Cindy Merkel from our team here monitoring that chat, so we'll get those questions as we go through. I am Rachel Camella, your host from the CertaPay HR team, and this is our first coffee break. So I am drinking a Hainer Roman from Peru. It is delicious. From Temple Coffee, candied lemon, fig, and black tea, and that is exactly what I'm getting. So I hope you all have some good coffee to share during this coffee break. And you're here with the CertaPay HR Ninja team. We call ourselves the Ninjas because we are fast, we think on our feet, and we have your back. So you can rely on us when you need HR issues. And now's the time when I hope everybody realizes HR is a really important component when we're dealing with a pandemic and we're dealing with these workplace issues that are surrounding new situations that we've been dealing with. And your HR team, whether you have one or you're looking to add one in, is going to be critical in helping you navigate these waters. So let's dig in. So we're talking about the remote workforce. Hey, Cindy, how's my screen looking?
So far so good. Can anybody type in the chat box so we know we've got you captured?
Yeah, good idea. If we could just get some messages in the chat box, good morning, hello, what kind of coffee you're drinking, anything like that, so we know our chat box is working. There's Claire. Thanks, Michelle. Tammy's in. Very good. Starbucks chai latte. I would expect nothing less from Claire.
Good morning, this is Jan.
Somebody's drinking beer. That is awesome. 2 espresso shots. Yes, Cindy. All right. So let's see what we have. When we talk about establishing a remote workforce, there are a lot of things you want to think about that may be different. So things you want to consider. And when we talk about office space versus remote workspace, there's a lot of similarities, but you have to think about some new factors to bring that into place. And there's a good chance that we won't go back to the huge percentage of our workforce being in an office. I think we were headed toward a trend of, in the next 5 years, having at least half of our workforce working remotely. I think this has just pushed us there faster. And so that may be a good thing. Now, there are a lot of positions where working remotely is not possible, and that's something that we can intertwine. But when you have a position that can be remote, why not establish that as a normal practice in your business? So when you talk about some of these issues, you want to have a policy for that. Policies protect you, policies give guidance to the employees, and policies establish a framework, especially when you talk about performance. If you have a policy that specifically talks to the expectations that you have for performance, then it's a little bit more clear. And if somebody is not used to working remotely, then that is the exact individual who needs a step-by-step guideline for how to perform their job from a remote location. And we're going to talk about some specific things with managing performance in our next coffee break. But for this one, having a policy in place will be important. And maybe that means you need to take a look at your job descriptions. Do you need to make some changes to your job descriptions to the way you have it listed? Maybe a particular job can be partially remote instead of completely remote or completely in the office. Maybe you have some people in the position that would be remote, but not all. Maybe you have some flexibility there. So think about what you need to list in your job description. Having your hours is an interesting thing to discuss when we're talking about a remote workforce, because your business hours might be 8 to 5, but maybe the actual work that has to happen during those times can be any time. So adding flexibility to the hours worked is a conversation to have. Again, something that you might add in the job description. So if you need somebody to work for 8 hours in a day, does it matter which 8 hours they are? And so that's a conversation that you want to have with the individual employee, and you want to make sure your job descriptions match what your expectations are there. Now, there are certain things where there are certain jobs and industries where the office hours are the only times that the work can occur, and that's fine. Again, something that you want to have some clear guidelines and clear parameters listed. When we talk about classifications, when we talk about the Department of Labor and FLSA guidelines, we have job classifications that matter. So you have exempt employees and non-exempt employees, your hourly employees. And if somebody is working from home and they are working, then that is time on the clock. That would be time that should be compensated like normal as an hourly employee. So if, again, when I talked about they need to work for 8 hours in the day, but which 8 hours, do you have timekeeping devices set up that can handle that? Do you have an electronic system so that when they log into their computer to work, they're clocking in at that time? And then maybe they clock out an hour later and come back to it later and they work 2 hours. Is that okay? Does that match your business? Something that should be included in the conversation in the job description. But you want to think in terms of if somebody is working for you, then they're getting paid for that time, especially if they are a non-exempt hourly employee. All hours worked should be time that you're paying for. And then again, if somebody's working over 40 hours in a week, that would be time and a half. And depending on your state, maybe over 8 hours in a day would be a time and a half. You're in California, you're working on the 7th day in a row, you've got double time. So think about your state's overtime laws as well. And the general rule, of course, overtime does apply. Even though they're working from home, working is working. So any questions about that? Does that make sense?
You're good, Rach. Keep going.
All right. So managing, when we talk about goals in the job descriptions and the conversation, the expectations, again, we're going to dive into this a little bit more about the how-to when it comes to managing performance. But for the purpose of this week, establish some timing for your goals conversations. And instead of having a performance review discussion, it makes sense when you have remote employees to establish goals. And what is the timeline going to be? Every Monday morning, we're going to have a goals meeting and a goals conversation. We're going to talk about what got done last week, what are the goals for this week, and then we'll address it again. What did we accomplish as we start the next goals? Maybe it's daily, maybe it's weekly, monthly. I think quarterly might start to get a little bit long when you have somebody working from home. I think it's important to communicate with them and touch base with them on a regular basis, timely. Performance issues are something that you don't want to let go when you've got your workforce separated. So addressing them in your goals discussions and in your daily calls and daily meetings makes more sense than letting them go to some review time period. Also, when we talk about working from home, a conversation to have is about work comp. So not only do you need to reach out to your work comp agency and have the conversation, let them know you have a remote workforce, and make sure your employees working from home are coded properly. You also want to have a conversation about safety and work comp with the individuals working from home. So when we talk about a work comp claim, it has to be a work-related injury. So let's say somebody is working from home and they are bending down trying to fix the printer to print something that they're working on, and they hurt their back while they're working on that printer. That would be a work-related injury. Now, let's say we've got somebody who is working from home and they've gone to the kitchen to refill their coffee, and the phone rings in their office. So they are running back to catch the phone call, only they trip over the dog on the way. This is not a work-related injury. That is a circumstantial situation that obviously should be addressed, but not a work comp injury. Does that make sense, those differences? And these are things that when we have everybody together in an office, we really try to establish some safety measures and some guidelines. And the things that come up at home typically don't come up in the office. Like, you're not going to trip over your dog at the office. So those are things that you want to have a conversation with your employees. So that takes us right into the next conversation. That's about the equipment. Something, again, to talk about, you want to establish policies and procedures for everything. So if you are providing equipment for your employees, if you're going to help them set up a home office or not, if you will not be paying for those pieces, you want to have a clear conversation about it and an agreement about which equipment belongs to the company and which does not, and what's covered and what's not. And then you want to have a reliable internet connection. This is the lifeline. So having the internet, the cell phone use, all of these things established ahead of time to make sure that when somebody is working from home, it is useful and productive, and it doesn't change their ability to do their job.
And it also might be worth looking into VPN options for security purposes.
Absolutely, and that's coming up on the next slide. So when you work in a home environment also, like I talked about tripping over the dog, you might also have some background noise that isn't typical. So being mindful of that and having that written into your work from home policy, that every effort should be taken to minimize background noise and background distractions and other things that could happen. For example, I don't want to use the dog example too many times, but it's such a good one. I think we've all been on a call where we've got the dog barking in the background of somebody on the meeting, and it's extremely distractive. So you want to make sure you set up an environment that is productive and secure of these other distractions. Also have a conversation and pay attention to what kind of setup somebody has. If somebody is sitting in a desk that's uncomfortable or a chair that isn't really designed for sitting and working in any length of time, if somebody needs to have a situation where they're standing or sitting or have some different ergonomic setup, I think it makes sense to have that conversation. And as Cindy mentioned, I think a VPN is a great measure to set up. When we talk about cybersecurity with remote working, it's a new ballgame. When we have our office setting, everything is closed in. You have your company's VPN, you have the network that's secure, you have your IT department working on all these pieces. When you send everybody out to their homes and they're working remotely, you now have huge exposure. So it's something that should be taken seriously. We've already seen so many different cyber attacks because of this situation changing and people not thinking about it ahead of time. So establish some policies surrounding your cybersecurity and your company's procedure around that. Do you want to set up specific password maintenance and timeframes to change passwords, multi-factor authentication, VPNs, different types of networks that are set up to secure all of your company's data and information? You want to think about what kind of level of protection do you need because of your industry, and how do you establish that, and how do you set that up? In addition to simple things like locking your computer when you walk away from it, locking a desk or file cabinets, any kind of information now that you've got at home. I mentioned printing something off to work. And if you're in the office, that all of that information is secured and locked in your office and in the building when you leave. But in your home, you want to think of the same thing. If you have notes and printed papers and documents and information, having locked files is just as important at home. So having those policies surrounding your company's protected information and intellectual property is important to have listed in your security policy. And periodic updates on computer equipment. It's a good idea to separate and only have company laptops when people are working from home. If they're using their individual personal equipment, then your risk of exposure is much greater. So I'm not saying don't do that. If that's the only option you have, just think about the cybersecurity layers that you would need to implement. Any questions so far?
Not yet, Rachel.
So when we talk about just setting up the security and the infrastructure and the policies and procedures, that's kind of the first step. When you're sending people out to work from home, we think it's a great idea. If your company has the ability to do this, if somebody needs a phone and a computer to do their job, then you now have a lot of flexibility. And there's nothing wrong with making that a possibility for your organization. And maybe even in the interest of dealing with the pandemic and social distancing, it might make sense to keep as many people working remotely as possible and even switch to some policies where you have a higher percentage of remote workers going forward than you normally would. So feel free to ask questions. Anything that we have coming out, yes, we will be happy to provide you guys with an outline. I can give you these slides. And we had Tammy Dawson on our team work on a fantastic document about working from home. We can get that out to you guys shortly. And please join us next week for sure. We're going to talk about some managing from the aspect of performance when you have a remote workforce. How do you keep them motivated and engaged? How do you deal with performance issues when people are remote? So we're going to keep this topic going on our future coffee breaks. And also if you have
suggestions, go ahead, Rachel.
No, I was going to say the same thing you were saying. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you all have any suggestions for us, things that you would think that would, be necessary for you moving forward, please let us know. And obviously, the more comments we get, we can certainly put different topics together for a multitude of other people as well.
Absolutely. Any topics, the whole point of this is to help you guys out. We want to make sure that we're talking about information that you need. And so please send us or type it in the chat or send us an email to the hrinfo@CertaPay email, and we will we'll use those topics for future coffee breaks.
Rachel, we do have a few questions. The first one is, would you recommend that employers require a certain operating system or software update on an employee's personal computer?
That is a great question for an IT person, which I am not.
So the answer is check with whomever is currently doing your IT platform and get their suggestions for the best practices for your business.
Right. And I would say my overall answer is yes, there will be specific things that will help protect you and your business and your company's intellectual data. So I would definitely look into that and find specific updates and things that make sense for you.
I have another question for you. If the employee is working well from home, do they have to come back to the office, especially if they have health issues?
Yeah, that is exactly what we're talking about here. It's a business decision. So how you take all of this information and think about it and make the best decision for your organization. But if they're doing a great job from home, and if that position makes sense to be located as a remote position, then why not? There are so many benefits to having a remote workforce, potentially decreasing your office hard dollar costs and expenses, weighed against the productivity that you get. Again, these are business decisions that you want to weigh out and what makes sense for you. In this time where we do have people who are concerned, you might have people with childcare issues or compromised immune systems, or somebody who's caring for an elderly parent, somebody who really needs to stay home right now. That is a perfect case where you would say, you know what, this is working, it's working great. Why not keep that individual working from home and safe at the same time? I think that's a great question to ask and see what makes the best sense for your business.
Rachel, just for argument's sake, to take that question a step further, what would be the long-term ramifications of choosing some folks to work from home due to health issues versus others?
So now we're going to talk about an issue with this question that takes us to discrimination and equal treatment. So when you look at the possibility of keeping somebody working from home, why not keep everybody in that similar position if it's possible? So if the position itself, again, when I talked about job descriptions at the beginning of this talk, we're really looking at something that makes sense across the board. So if a particular job description also has remote work available or remote work possibilities, then you can leave it up to the employee. If the position itself can be done remotely, but the employee says, nope, I'm good to go, I would rather work in the office, it's better for me, the dog, it's crazy, whatever. Or if the person says, you know what, I love that this position has a remote working option, I would like to choose that. And so you offer it across the board to everybody in that position, then that protects you. You're not discriminating against anybody in particular, and you're creating an environment that has a lot of flexibility, and that's going to set you apart.
Next question. How about paying for a cell phone bill as their usage or as their use in their, and is there any requirements for paying for their bill? Everyone has different amounts on, is there any guidelines? I suggest you set up a specific amount of money, whether it be $50 a month, whatever you deem fair and consistent. And if my bill is $500, you pay me $50. If Rachel's bill is only $60, she's only paying $10. I think it needs to be fair and consistent, and everyone gets the same allotment of money.
Yeah, that's a great question, great recommendation, because you want to be consistent with all these pieces that you do. And check your state requirements too, because some states do require that if you're asking somebody to use their own phone, that you have to provide some compensation for it. Well, there's some flexibility there too. Check your state's requirements. But when you are asking somebody to use their own phone, I think it's a best practice to provide a stipend or an expense for that. And just like Cindy said, it makes sense to just create a flat amount. If you are using your own cell phone, then everybody gets a flat rate toward that of $50 or $100, whatever makes sense, versus you're providing company phones to everyone. So again, something you want to weigh out, and it's a piece of equipment that is essential to working from home. So you really want to think in terms of, when you set somebody up, are you giving them the tools they need to do their job? And if they were in your building, you would be paying for their phone. So if they're working from home and you expect them to be answering the phone and using the phone, then it makes perfect sense as a best practice to give them money for that phone and pay for the service.
Also think about this in terms of their internet service. Obviously, the majority of us use our internet for our televisions and a multitude of things. But again, if I'm going to be using my internet from home for a work, it may be prudent to pay me a percentage of the monies to cover that as well.
And this is where those policies and agreements are important. And maybe you're providing, as a part of their compensation, a communication allowance, and that would cover the any changes to the VPN, any changes to the internet service, and a stipend toward a cell phone. So if you have a communication allowance, that's part of that individual's compensation. And again, maybe it's tied to the job description. So if you are a remote worker in this particular job, the communication allowance is X. And that's, again, the same across the board for anybody in that same position.
I have no more questions for you.
Any other questions, guys? All right. Did one just pop in? What if somebody is, I know. What if somebody's working from home?
Working from home and doesn't want to come back into the office because of fear. Well, that's a short-term versus a long-term answer.
Yeah, that is a good topic for another coffee break, actually, as I suspect that's going to be an issue that we talk about. In fact, we have our Getting Back to Work webinar this afternoon at 2 o'clock. If anybody wants to join that, send us a message and we'll send you the link, and we're going to cover that information. If the position itself is available and the people can do it remotely and work from home, then I would consider allowing that to continue a bit longer. If the actual job requires that they come into the office or be at the location, then it's a different conversation that you want to really kind of look at and see, what are you dealing with in that regard.
If anybody wants any additional information, we'll leave the window open. Could you please put your email address into the chat box, and I will download the chat box, and we will make sure that you get the information. But I need an email address.
Or you can send us an email to that HR info, and we'll send you information.
That's true. That will work.
So again, please join us next week, same time. Coffee break number 2 is going to be managing the time and performance of remote workforce. And same thing, we want to keep it short, single topics. And any ideas you have, send them our way. We can create single topics for our coffee breaks all year long. We're excited to have you here. We appreciate your time this morning. And we value all of you. And thank you for sharing your coffee break with CertaPay this morning, the HR Ninjas. Hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.